what about some of the more controlled processes we can engage in? And one thing that characterizes most of these is that there's the perceiver's intent is determining how the process operates. And we'll come on to a definition of intent in a few slides' time. But first, let's just consider a couple of types of controlled processes that are still sort of in that middle boundary between combining some controlled elements with also some automatic processes occurring here. So we're going to begin by looking at goal-dependent automaticity. So we have sometimes these goal-driven automatic processes, and this is basically where we might have an overarching ultimate goal that we want to achieve that leads us to engage in some sort of cognitive process, but the way that that cognitive process unfolds is generally outside of our control. So we're not continually monitoring how we're achieving that goal. It's occurring automatically without us exerting much attention or effort over our behavior. So a couple of examples of this might be, you imagine riding a bicycle or a scooter to a friend's house. The initial intentional element of this is your conscious decision that I'm going to choose out of the many different alternative modes of transport. I'm going to choose to get on my bike and go to my friend's house that's in this specific location. But once you're on the bike, most of the time the processes involved are generally pretty automatic. You're not thinking about the different steps in riding a bike. You may not even think about the directions if you're familiar with that route. Similarly, if you go to a party, there might be the overarching goal that you have in your mind to socialize with other people, and this then automatically triggers behaviors that are conducive to this. So you might automatically trigger the fact that you smile in response to other people more often. You seek out people that look like they're fun and maybe avoid those that look like they're less fun or a little bit boring. So these would be automatic things that we do just to achieve that goal of socializing. As well as being able to trigger automatic processes that serve an intentional goal that we're pursuing, there are also times when we can trigger automatic thoughts that are inconsistent with our conscious preference. So they're inconsistent with our current overarching goals. So one example to demonstrate this is if I asked you to not think of a white bear. So that's all you've got to do is not think of that white bear, and if a bear comes to mind, you can tap the table or just signify to yourself that you've failed in this task. So just try and do that for the next 10-15 seconds. So this is exactly what Daniel Wegner did in the 1980s, where he ran a study and just asked participants to suppress thoughts of a white bear and ring a bell every time that they failed in this task. And as you might find with yourself doing this, participants in his study found it very difficult to suppress these thoughts, so they would continually pop into your mind. And he termed this a ironic process. So ironic because we're trying to suppress it, but we seem to fail in the exact thing that we're trying our hardest not to do. And in trying to explain why this happens, why we find it so difficult with thought suppression, Daniel Wegner put forward this ironic process theory, which essentially argued that we have two operating systems, one that acts consciously and effortfully, and one that's relatively automatic. So he argues that we have a conscious and effortful operating process that will try to maintain the sort of ideal or the appropriate state of mind. So in this case, not activating thoughts of the white bear. So for example, if you're trying to suppress the thoughts of highly craved snack food, then we might seek out other less dangerous thoughts to distract ourselves. So we intentionally and effortfully direct our attention towards other cues or other ideas would be put in our minds. However, Wegner also argued that we have this more automatic process that he called a monitoring process, which is basically looking out for anything that's going to indicate that we have failed in the current task that we're doing. So anything that indicates we failed our suppression of the white bear or whatever else we're trying to suppress. And this basically has the paradoxical effect of the fact that it's constantly looking out for this failure, that it sensitizes us to essentially be more likely to end up picking out. So it's sensitizing our mind to the very thought we're seeking to avoid, and it raises the activation level of this concept of the white bear or whatever food you're trying to suppress. And the problem with this is that it ironically then makes it more likely that we end up bringing that into mind. Now you might find yourself, as I give you those examples of suppressing thoughts about a white bear, thinking, how is this relevant? I'm not going to find myself in real life needing to suppress the thoughts of a white bear. But the difficulty with thought suppression is probably most pronounced or kind of well seen in everyday life with individuals who engage in prolonged rumination. So rumination involves the sort of repetitive, counterproductive thinking, and unwanted negative thoughts. So there's negative self-talk that you might engage in. That's all hallmarks of depression and anxiety disorders. So in these cases, rumination can present a real problem. It's individuals that the last thing they want to do is engage in negative talk, negative self-talk, but maybe this constant vigilance for not wanting to have negative thoughts actually has an ironic effect of encouraging them at times. So I've said before that this idea of intent is a key defining property of what determines whether something is a controlled process or not. But what exactly does intent refer to, and how can we define it? And put simply, it reflects having options. So options and alternatives in the way that we think and act. So if we're making a decision or an action, it should be one out of many possible options that we needed to have selected. So it can't typically be the sort of default path that we're taking. And the degree of intentionality is determined by how much or how far our response is from what you would expect the default to be, and how much attention we then direct towards implementing this intentional behavior or action. So as a thought experiment here, imagine that a romantic partner or someone who is very close to you, so it could be a very close friend, they tell you that they hate you. Have a think about what might be a low effort automatic response, so one that doesn't require much intent. And then what would be a much more intentional alternative response that you could engage in response to hearing those words. And you can think about different stages of, firstly, how you might interpret the comment, how you might choose an appropriate response, and then how you would monitor how you implement this response. So see if you can think of these different steps. So in this example of intentional and what would be low intentional responses to somebody being hostile and saying they hate you, we can think about the fact that the most default response would be to take this at face value. So when we're trying to interpret why they've said it, we just assume that they genuinely do hate you. We would reciprocate the hostility. So you might say, I hate you back. And this starts a spiral of an argument that's going on here. We react without too much thought, so we're not processing in much detail. And generally this would be a kind of a default baseline automatic response to hearing the words, I hate you. On the other hand, at each of those stages, we could take a more intentional approach. So an alternative option would be to excuse the person. So when we're hearing them say, I hate you, rather than take this at face value, is to see it within a context or particular circumstances that maybe they're having a bad day. There's some other factor that's accounting for why they're saying this to you, and they don't genuinely hate you. We can then choose in the way that we respond to perhaps not reciprocate the hostility. So this could be saying nothing, or we could inquire more about them. And then we can pay attention to the situation. So we can invest some effort into trying to understand the other person's situation. And all of these things would reflect a much more intentional way of responding in that situation and to that kind of hostile behavior from the other person. So this notion of intent implies that we have some degree of free will over our choices. So it's under our own control, our own volition, whether we choose to take the alternative option. We can decide that. We're in charge of the course of our ship and the options that we're taking. And intuitively, for many of us, we do feel like we've got a strong sense of control over the choices that we make in our life. However, there's a lot of researchers that suggest that this intuitive sense of free will is actually very much an illusion. So for example, John Barge, who we've already met earlier, he makes an argument that actually a lot of our behavior is primarily automatic. And at the most extreme, he says that 99.4% of a person's everyday life is determined not by their conscious intentions and deliberate choices, but by mental processes that are put into motion by features of the environment that operate outside of our conscious awareness. So that's 99.44%. So the vast majority of choices and decisions that you make in your daily life are not things that we have any conscious control over. It's not things that we're exerting any intentional control or attention towards. Similarly, Daniel Wegner argues that we have this illusion of consciousness or free will, and our actions are actually caused by unconscious processes, yet we draw the mistaken inference that our actions are determined by our conscious intentions. So here you can draw a link between the kind of subconscious mind is what's driving the actions, and then we just make some post hoc rationalization or explanation for why we would have consciously chosen that option that was actually driven by automatic subconscious processes here. And these arguments generally fall under the kind of concept of social ignition. So it's arguing that the environment is the key thing that's triggering goals, and these goals automatically trigger corresponding actions. Like I just said, we then rationalize and infer the reasons behind our actions to give us what is essentially a sort of illusion of free will, or an illusion of control over our behavior. And a lot of this is supported by some compelling experimental evidence that sort of questions our intuitive sense of free will. It's also at the more extreme level. It's kind of taken as this argument of a sort of Zombian approach, that we are effectively automatons or zombies that are at the behest of our environment.
Put your hand in front of you and flex your wrist. You presumably first had a thought. Flex my wrist. That then caused your wrist to move. That's how it seems. But Benjamin Libet's experiments in the 1980s have cast some doubt on that. In his neuroscience lab, he wired up subjects to an EEG machine measuring brain activity via electrodes on their scalps, and then asked them to choose to perform a simple hand movement when they felt like it. He also got them to record the time at which they made a conscious decision to move their hands. Disconcertingly, he found evidence of brain activity initiating the movement hundreds of milliseconds before the conscious decision was reported. In other words, his experiments seemed to show that the conscious decision didn't cause the movement. The brain activity bringing about movement started before the individual willed anything to happen. Some people think this is proof that free will is an illusion, that our conscious decisions are more like reports on what is already happening than the causes of our action. Libet didn't go that far. He thought that we might not have free will, but there's still time for what some have called free won't, a conscious veto of an action that is started in the brain. Others are more skeptical about the implications of these experiments. They point out difficulties of recording the time of a subjective decision to move, and question whether Libet's findings could apply to more complex conscious decisions based on reasons, such as the decision to reject the claim that Libet's experiments undermine our idea of free will.
Okay, so you should have a pretty decent idea of what was going on there, but just to be absolutely clear, you've got participants sitting in the laboratory and they're told to observe a clock. So it was a special clock that rotated once every 2.56 seconds, and then participants were told to move their finger at any time of their choosing. And you have to use this clock to record the precise moment when you decide to initiate the movement. And in different variants of the experiment, it would be when you choose to perform the action, or there might be an opportunity to cancel the action at the last moment. Certainly in the original 1983 one, it was just initiating the movement. And then you've got to report the clock position at the time of the conscious intention to act. Now, the crucial evidence or the results that come out of this is when you look at the scalp recordings of the neural activity. So this is using voltage scalp EEG, so electroencephalography, and it's recording the activity of the brain relative to the 0 milliseconds when the action was initiated. If we look back from that time point to what's marked as W, this is when participants would typically, so on average, when they would report a conscious, explicit awareness of the intention to move their finger. Now, the bit that's sort of fascinating and relevant here is that you have this increase in neural activation that starts occurring all the way back at 550 milliseconds prior to the action occurring, but also well in advance of us having any explicit awareness that we intend to move our finger. So the argument here is that there has to be some unconscious process that's going on that is driving our decision to move our finger that precedes the conscious awareness of us willing or wanting to initiate the action. So this is a very famous study and has been used as kind of strong argument against the fact, the idea that we have as much free will as we believe we do. However, there's some important criticisms that came in from the experimental design here. One of these is the fact that there was large variability in participants' behavior. So there's a lot of individual differences between the activation that you get preceding the moment of intention. There's a lot of sources of error in the measurement as well. So there's error in working out when the readiness potential starts, so what you choose as the threshold for when activation begins to increase. There's also a lot of error in participants identifying the onset of their conscious wish to move the finger. So if you're looking at this moving clock and you've got to try and make an accurate estimate, it's very difficult to know when you genuinely did consciously intend to begin this. And then there's also these arguments of ecological validity. So finger tapping is not something that we really do too much in everyday life. It's a pretty inconsequential behavior compared to a lot of the other more complex choices. So is it the case that when we're making a complex decision, so choosing between which university you want to go to, who you want to marry, etc., it's not really the same simplistic process. So do these implications apply to more complex cases? And important conscious decisions have been made. So outside of just this finger tapping, the participants in the study, they've made the volitional choice to move the finger. They've made a choice to watch the clock, and they've made the decision to actually come in and participate in the study. So these are the things that you can't really ignore. There are other choices that are being made here. So this study and the data from it have become very famous and are often used as a strong argument against the idea of free will. But as said in the video, Liebert himself never went that far. He didn't really argue against the idea of free will. And indeed, in another study that he ran using the same basic paradigm, he instructed participants that once you feel the urge, so you get a sense that you're about to flex, move your finger, that you should inhibit any behavioral response. And I think what was really interesting in those studies is that you would find, if you look at the neural responses, you would see this rise of the readiness potential. And as people would then realize that they're experiencing this urge, that they're able to veto and stop the initiation of their action, and this readiness potential would correspondingly decrease. So it seemed in some ways pretty convincing evidence that we have this idea of free won't, that we certainly have power, even if there's a automatic subconscious initiation of a drive towards one action. So you can think of this as there's an automatic temptation towards something. We have the conscious ability to veto and control our behavior and say, no, I'm not going to do that. So one example that you might think of in everyday life is, say, if you're sitting there doing some work and suddenly this temptation comes in to do a distractor. So whether you want to go on YouTube and watch cat videos or find something stupid on TikTok, whilst you maybe don't necessarily have control over that urge that arises, we do have, I think, a lot more control over the ability to say no, to veto the fact that we do engage in that or not. Like I say, our success at vetoing it may not always be successful, and we'll look at this in some of the lectures on self-control, that I think our willpower really does suck. But we certainly do have the ability to inhibit if we're willing to invest a bit of effort and stop ourselves being distracted. So, procrastination is a good example. Might automatically become distracted from a task, but once we become consciously aware of our off-task behavior, we can choose to veto this procrastination. It also seems important that people actually have this illusion of free will. So whether we genuinely have free will or not, having an intuitive belief or a sense that our actions are under our own control can have important benefits. So when we stop believing that we're free agents, we tend to see ourselves, for example, as being a lot less blameworthy. So certainly within the kind of criminal courts, if you feel like your actions are outside of your control, then yeah, you're going to feel like you are less to blame for anything that you do that's harmful or negative towards others. So in one study, Catherine Vose and Schooler, participants were induced to believe free will is illusory, found out that they were much more likely to be willing to cheat on a maths test. Catherine Vose, in another study, the belief in free will predicted job performance. So the more that you feel like you're in control of your behavior, the more likely you are to invest effort performing to the best of your ability. Whereas if you think you're just riding a wave of other people's choices, maybe make fewer effective decisions. You invest less effort. You let that wave take you where it's going. And so work by Roy Baumeister and colleagues showed that diminished belief in free will makes people less generous, more stressed, less happy, and have lower sense in life's meaningfulness. So generally, the idea is that a belief in free will, whether we have it or not, is probably quite an adaptive, positive thing. I think a good example for illustrating how we might sometimes have the illusion of the belief of us being the agents of our own actions is shown by the fact that we can often have illusions about our causal role in other people's behaviors. So we often believe that we can influence the behaviors and the outcomes of things that it is essentially impossible, or we know that we genuinely don't influence these outcomes. So in one experiment by Pronin, Wegner, and McCarthy and Rodriguez, people developed the illusion that they had magically caused someone else's outcomes. So in one study, participants were induced to harbour evil thoughts about a Confederate who was obnoxious as opposed to a neutral. And then participants played a witch doctor, where they had to stick pins into a voodoo doll that was allegedly representing the other person. And then when the victim reported that they felt that they'd got a headache, that they weren't feeling well, participants would feel like they were causally responsible for this headache. Something that you might be more familiar with is you get these similar effects that can occur in sport. So they ran a study where they asked spectators to silently root for a friend or a peer that was shooting basketballs into a hoop. And when the shooter subsequently succeeded, they felt that their silent wishes, so their prayers, had helped the person to succeed. So this can be very much the same as if you're a fan of a football team, and maybe there's some superstition that you get that they win a big match when you're watching it in one location, or maybe it's every time that you go to watch them live that they end up losing, or vice versa. You can have a belief that you are the one that's exerting some influence on the outcome there. And you might have someone that says, like, oh, if I go to the game, I know that they'll lose. That's some illusory belief of causality there. And I think by realizing this, it does give you that nice bit of insight into the fact that we can believe we're causing things that we definitely can't, means that this illusion of free will could equally be plausible for explaining our own behaviors.